my name is Craig Nielson, and I am currently 58 years old. So today you're going to be hearing about the debilitating experience I had way back when I was 21 years old. I was so absolutely crippled with depression and anxiety that I reached a point where I literally could not function. I grew up feeling a lot of fear, and I didn't feel very safe. I had a very low self-esteem. So one of the things I did, I started playing drums when I was 8 years old. And at early in life, I figured, well, I'll become a rock star someday, and then everybody will love me, and I'll marry a supermodel, and, a very naive goal in life. But one I pursued wholeheartedly, because from high school, I went off to Hollywood and I went to music school and I started playing in bands and doing a little studio work. Then reality caught up to me. I became very disillusioned with the music business, and that whole idea that I'm going to become a rock star someday began to crumble. Also, around this period, I hadn't been invited by a friend to attend a retreat weekend. And it was called Search for Christian Maturity. I grew up in the church. Mainly, I went to church because I'd have an obligation. That's what the family did. And I went on this only because I felt that it would be a good opportunity to meet girls. So I went on it, but I had a very profound experience through it. And I actually did meeting a girl there, and we did start to date. And shortly after I finished music school, it was weird because I just started to, I call it unravel. And I couldn't pinpoint one, event that was traumatizing. It was just, I literally felt I was losing my mind. I would fall into deep fits of depression where I wept and I just couldn't stop. And these emotions were just coming up everywhere. I had major panic attacks. Like I said, what was most frustrating is I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. My life at that point wasn't hard. I mean, I had a girlfriend. I had things going for me. The long story of this, I ended up in a hospital. I call it, that's the flatline moment in my life. As to what actually, in recovery, what I started to make sense of was the fact that I became very good at suppressing emotions. I would suppress emotions, and I learned to hide, because if you don't speak out, you don't piss people off. So I think the way I make sense of it is I had this unique experience through this retreat. I was dating somebody who, for the first time in my life, I cared for another person. And I think all that together just allowed years and years and years of suppressed emotions to come to the surface. One thing I did find, or that happened to me, was while I was in the hospital, it was actually the first night I was there. Now, when I got into the hospital, they did pump me with a bunch of drugs, antidepressants and whatnot. I'm laying in bed. At this point, emotionally, I just felt absolutely nothing. I had no feeling at all emotionally. The one thing that I wanted desperately in that moment was I wanted to die. I mean, I figured, okay, things can't get any worse for me. I mean, here I am, laid out flat in a hospital. I have no hope that this will get better, and I wanted to die. Well, because I had grown up in the church, people often ask me, was I ever suicidal? And the truth was, no, I wasn't. Only because going to church, I had some understanding that my existence was God's doing. So I held God responsible. I was living at home at the time. I had a warehouse job that I was working, and it was driving home to work. There was some instrumental music playing over the radio, and there was something in that just allowed me to crumble. As I'm driving, I started to sob again, just crying, had all these strong emotions again, and I became scared. I was like, as the tears were coming out of my eyes, it was hard to focus where I was driving, and I was only a mile or two from home when this happened. I figured, my focus just be, get home safe. So I managed to get home. I get out of my car, just still this emotional mess. I come through the door and collapsed onto the couch in just this emotional basket case. That time my parents saw this and, I think they were genuinely shocked. My dad came over and tried to figure out, what happened. Did you get in an accident? Did you end up killing somebody? And I couldn't answer. I was just, I didn't know. My memory of that situation was, I laid on the couch for a while and then eventually I just went to bed. I called in sick to work. And then my parents, after in that morning, said, hey, you need help beyond anything we can do. And, we've contacted this hospital and, we think it'd be good for you or something to that effect. I mean, I didn't care at this point. I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. Because again, I wanted to die. And that's what happens when you go in a hospital in my thinking, sick people go to a hospital. So going back to lying in bed in the hospital, I lashed out at God and said, either you fix this, because again, I held him responsible for my existence. Either you fix this or you take me home right now. And a little bit later, a voice just spoke to me. And it wasn't anything dramatic. It was a simple message that you do your part, I'll do mine. And at first, I was like, whoa. And I started to try to rationalize it. Well, they pumped me up with all these drugs. Maybe I imagined this. And then I thought, no, because that's not something I would have imagined. And so I just decided, why not just go with it? So the very next day you got up, I got to do my part. And the first thing was I had to go eat. So I went to the cafeteria of the hospital and I remember, literally forcing myself to eat. And, I decided while I was there, I was going to do everything that I was told to do, everything that was prescribed to me. One of the first things I did was they got us into the gym to exercise. I had taken a liking to bicycling because that's one of the things I was doing to increase my endurance for drum playing. So they had a stationary bike in there and I got on that and I kind of just got lost in it. And before I knew it, the recreational therapist come to me and said, it's time, we're done. It's time to go. And everybody else had gone. And then we got into, group therapy. I was in there with people who had much more horrifying stories than I did. People who had been sexually assaulted, people who had witnessed murders. And that's what got me thinking, kind of uncomfortable. I said, none of that's happened to me, And as I was introducing myself and, I mentioned that to the others, I said, I don't have any of these horrific experiences like you all have, but I can't deny how I feel. It was encouraging to me because later that day, one of the other patients came up to me and said, one of them who did have a horrific story, and he told me, you're in the right place. So I felt encouraged by that. And then it was getting into, hooking up with a psychologist. It helped that she was Catholic. That was the church I had grown up with. So spiritually, she knew where I was coming from. And I just diligently worked the program. I went into biofeedback, which is a technique I learned to tense and relax my muscles so they'll allow more blood flow. Because that was one of the things I actually learned there, that I was carrying so much stress in my upper back and neck that it was actually restricting blood flow to my brain. That was a big moment in realization in learning that technique and how to, relax and allow blood flow to continue. So as I was going through the program, I felt I was getting better. And at 3 weeks is when I got the idea that, wow, I'm getting comfortable here. And the thought of going back out into the real world was still scary. But I made the decision that it's time for me to leave and get back to the real world. Now, that was, the people at the hospital were not supportive of that whatsoever. They said usually it takes a good 5 to 7 weeks for somebody to make a full recovery in here. Knowing that I was doing my part, God would be doing his. I call that was my license to be fearless. I didn't just leave blindly. I made a plan. I said, I will continue to see my psychologist on an outpatient basis. I will come back to the hospital once a week for group therapy, but I need to get out and know that I can function in the real world. So they had me sign some release forms and whatnot, and I did leave. One of the things, because I had no identity anymore, I wasn't going to be a rock star, but what am I going to do? And then I got into school. I got into college and signed up for a bunch of classes, had no idea what I would major in, what I would do, but at least it gave me some structure in my life. It gave me something to go get up and go do. That's where I learned one of the greatest empowering things that I still continue to use today. I had gone to the counseling center there to take some assessment tests that kind of would hopefully give me some sense of what direction I would take my education and what I would ultimately become. When I went there, I met with a counselor to go over the results of the assessments, and he just asked the question. He says, well, how you doing? And me being honest, I said, well, honestly, I'm scared. He said, scared of what? I said, scared that I will fail. I said, I never did well in school. In grade school, middle school, high school, I never did well. I barely graduated. And the idea of a college degree just seems to me unattainable. And then he looked at me and he said, oh, prove it. I said, what do you mean, prove it? He said, prove you're not smart enough for college. He says, now how you're going to do that is you've got to show up to class on time every day. Next, you've got to do the work, meaning you got to actually crack open the textbooks and read them. And number 3, you got to actively participate in class, meaning when you have questions, you ask them. He goes, now, if you can do those 3 things at 100% for one semester, and at the end of it, you're failing, maybe we can say you're not smart enough. But if that happens to be the case, we'll have you tested for a learning disability. Well, that made sense to me. It brought the idea of a big, the whole college degree just down to one semester. And I figured, okay, this is either going to prove it or not. It made total sense to me, so I did that. Fast forward today, I hold a master's degree. So a lot of this, a lot of it went into my recovery. Education was key, as I explained. Physical endurance training. So I did continue bike riding, and that's something else I learned while I was in the hospital, is that when you exercise vigorously, endorphins in your body produce a natural antidepressant. So I knew I wanted to get off drugs as soon as possible, so that appealed to me. So I continued bike riding, and then eventually I got into running, I got into marathoning, and now I live at the slope of the Eastern Sierras and I do a lot of hiking. Physical activity is still to this day continues to be part of that plan. I've gone back to church and I go consistently. That's one of the things that I always believe is you have to believe in something greater than yourself. Some people would say, well, I put my faith in the universe has my back. It's a best-selling book out there right now. The universe has your back. Well, to me, God is the universe, but the point being is you got to believe in something bigger than yourself. You've got to get professional help. I continued to see my psychologist for a little bit over a year. I actually went into debt doing that, but I took on the mindset that it's either going to make or break me. And, well, I'm happy to say it did help me. It made me. So I got professional help, believing in something bigger than myself, physical exercise, going to school, and proving to myself that I could do something that I otherwise thought I was incapable of doing. I mean, all that has been part of the recovery plan. My story is one that honestly I kept hidden for many, many years. I did at one point in my career, I did 13 years working in law enforcement. It wasn't because I ever aspired to do so. It was just at the time I was newly married and I needed a job and they were hiring. But it came up during my background investigation. They had asked me, had I ever been hospitalized? And I had to be truthful. I'd say, yeah. What was that experience like for you? It's the best thing that ever happened to me. And then it was never talked about. I should go back a little bit and say another thing I discovered while going to school, and what am I going to do, was while I was taking general education classes, I took a speech class. And the first day the professor told us was, that public speaking was the number one fear of people in general. That was when I declared my major, because I figured okay, if that's true and I can do that, then I can do anything. So I got my bachelor's in speech, and that took me into, doing a little bit of sales. While I was in law enforcement, I got the itch to want to help people again. And that's when I applied to grad school and got in there. And I wanted to continue to help people more like me. So I got my master's degree in counseling and educational psychology. I spent 10 years after my 13 years in law enforcement counseling college students. And then that translated, eventually I also became, I got 3 times certified in life coaching in various modes too. About 5 years ago, and this is something I believe you've got to be of service to somehow and give back to your community. So my wife and I, through our church, had been doing some marriage preparation ministry. One of the things that we discuss in there is that when you come together in a relationship, you bring your history with you. So, what happened to me at age 21 was something I did have to reveal to my wife and let her know, this is what you're getting yourself into, type of a thing. The priest who was working with us at the time, afterwards, he said, I never knew that about you. He goes, that's a great story. From there, I was like, maybe I shouldn't be so ashamed of it. Maybe I should tell it more. And I have been doing that ever since. And it has really blossomed. And now I've written a book about it. The one thing I see today that really bothers me is that in our culture today, there seems to be this prevailing belief that if you happen to suffer from anxiety or depression, the solution is to medicate yourself for it. And also this faulty belief that, I am this way just because it's a mental defect, or that I have a chemical imbalance in my brain, or something to that effect. And that to me is sad, because I don't believe that. There is scientific proof that your thoughts drive the chemicals in your brain. So yes, you do have a chemical imbalance, but it's not a natural thing. It's a byproduct of your faulty thinking. And then, it also appears that some people wear it like some kind of badge of honor. I have anxiety. I have depression. Words mean things. If you say you have something, it's a condition. The one thing I learned in my recovery was to change that inner dialogue. So instead of saying like I have depression or I have anxiety, instead I say, at times I feel depressed. At times I feel anxious. But by that way, I separate myself from, it's not who I am, it's how I feel. So my mission is to spread my story and help others that may be trapped in that. It's just the way I am. It doesn't have to be. Yeah, it's a fight, but you can do it. You can overcome. You can create a life filled with more love and joy than you ever thought possible. It doesn't happen overnight, but you got to work it. You got to work at it. And I think also today, we have this instant gratification mentality that, I take the pill and I feel better. Okay, but would you rather live authentic happiness rather than a happiness that is dependent on something outside of you? And that's my mission. Because I think it implies, it implies a certain amount of weakness. I think they're afraid of it revealing them as being weak. I think the reason why men in particular don't talk about having depression or anxiety is because for them it's a sign of weakness. I don't want to appear weak. I don't want to appear vulnerable. But the fact is, there's 1 in 4 women popping pills for this, 1 in 7 men. So it's out there. For the guys, I'll just say there is no shame in admitting this problem. True strength for me came from admitting, yes, I need help. And I think that's another thing where there's a faulty belief of being weak, is that if I can't do it myself, I should be self-sufficient and do things myself. But, we get a lot more when we get help, when we ask for help. You just do. That's how teams function. Together, that's my favorite acronym of a team, is together everyone achieves more. I would say there's no shame in admitting you have this. There's no shame in reaching out for help. That to me is a sign of strength, to reach out and make yourself that vulnerable to, I need help. That to me takes courage. My favorite definition of courage that I've ever heard is courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done in spite of it or through it. Being afraid and moving forward. Being afraid and doing it anyway. That was another mantra that back when early on, when I was freshly out of the hospital and I was going to school, and often I would wake up in the morning and the first thing I wanted to do was just shut off the alarm and stay in bed. But you know, I developed a mantra to myself that in spite of how I feel, I'm going to do it anyway, and forcing myself to get up, get in the shower, get dressed, drive to school. And that was the other thing. I think, you know, that carries a certain momentum, is once you break out and you do those things, okay, now I'm in class, I'm in tune with that. Now I go to the library and I can read my book. So that I can't emphasize enough, because when you're in the depths of depression or anxiety, do not remain stuck in there. Move, talk to somebody, get out in nature, go for a walk, do something. Because if you just stand idle, the demons in your head are going to ravish you. Pray, meditate,